20th of November, 2015. Terrified hotel guests run for their lives as gunmen race through a luxury hotel in Bamako, the capital of Mali.
The Radisson Blu hotel attack was very shocking for the international community and for Mali itself. It saw militant groups overtake the Radisson Blu hotel for several hours, taking 170 hostages and killing 20 people.
An Islamist group linked to Al-Qaeda claim responsibility. This terror attack focuses the world's attention on the secret war unfolding in the Sahara Desert.
The only time that somewhere like Mali hits the press is when foreign nationals are targeted or killed in a terror attack.
It added to a continued concern by states like France and the US that Mali had become a safe haven for terrorist organizations.
Mali went from being one of Africa's most successful democracies to a failed state. The United Nations Security Council swiftly sent their troops to the region.
I have asked the President and Prime Minister to do on security sector reform and strengthen the capacity of Malian national forces.
This peacekeeping mission became the deadliest campaign in the history of the United Nations. American, Chinese, and French soldiers have all died in the sand dunes of northern Mali. Britain will send troops in 2020. Why are world leaders so eager to send secret special forces to fight in the Sahara? The landlocked West African nation of Mali is one of the biggest on the African subcontinent. Its borders are traversed by the Sahel, an acrid desert region which stretches across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. In the north is the city of Timbuktu. To the south, the capital, Bamako.
It's a big country with a small population. It is not strategically terribly important, but it is a really easy base for terrorists to operate from because it has vast areas of relatively desolate land.
This is where world leaders would send their troops to fight their secret war. A war which stems from a long history of furtive foreign intervention in Mali's affairs. The modern country of Mali was created by French colonialists at the turn of the 20th century. Their colony of French Sudan forced several different tribes to live together.
So you have the Bambaras are the sort of the dominant group. And then you have in the north an array of other ethnic groups, including Songhai, Fulani, or Pearl, Tuareg and Arabs. These groups tend to be lighter in skin, so they are very different, even physically, aesthetically, they have different features. This racial element is also very important to understand the current conflict between the north and the south of Mali.
France maintained its colonial power by playing one tribe off against the other, secretly sending weapons to one tribal chief while making promises to another. The colonialists' main focus was to extract as much wealth as possible from the region. This divide and conquer policy was possible because of Mali's unique history. The remote north has formed a key trading post on the African subcontinent since the Roman Empire.
The labor force was made out of slaves. There's also a historical memory and acrimony between the north and the south due to the fact that the Tuareg and the Arabs have a reputation for, in the past, having been slave traders. And so there's a racial issue that is also important here.
In 1960, Mali gained independence from France, along with its neighbors Algeria and Niger. France retained its military bases, troops, and influence in the region. The Tuareg and Bambara tribes were now part of one country, but it was not without its stresses and strains.
The north was particularly difficult to draw into the unity of Mali because historically it didn't belong to that part of the world. It was much closer to the Maghreb, to the Arab and Berber countries further north of the Sahara. And it was sort of forced into it.
The country's new government, led by Modibo Keïta, decided to adopt the approach taken by the French colonialists. Tribal chiefs seen as supportive of the new state received weapons and handouts. Those who opposed it were sent to prison. This policy led to rampant corruption across Mali. Nepotism became a fixed part of the new administration. Keïta's government, with its Bambara majority, swiftly gathered a monopoly on all of Mali's exports. International aid, designed to help Mali grow into a democratic nation, was diverted into the pockets of local politicians. As Keïta's cronies feathered their nests, the Tuareg were increasingly sidelined.
They were traditionally nomadic people in the middle of the Sahara and spreading across also into corners of Libya, Algeria, and Niger. Mali became independent in 1960, and over the decades since, there's been a series of Tuareg rebellions.
When Mali was proclaimed an independent state and France left, the Sonrai, the Tuareg, and the Arab groups in the north of the country wrote a letter where they stated that they did not want to be ruled by the central government of Mali. Why? Because the central government of Mali has the Bambara majority. That sort of set the precedent to the very first Tuareg rebellion that occurred in 1963 that was heavily repressed.
Survival was made all the harder by a series of droughts, which struck the north of Mali in the 1960s and 70s. The Tuareg left Mali to find work during this time of famine. They would return to their homeland decades later, hardened into a guerrilla fighting force after years of working as mercenaries in conflicts across the Sahel.
During the droughts, the amount of aid that was poured into Mali was so large that it's just impossible to understand how it sort of evaporated into nothing.
In 1968, the Malian military, led by Lieutenant Moussa Traoré, launched a coup. President Keïta was captured and would later die in prison, destitute. Traoré would rule Mali for more than 2 decades. His dictatorship swiftly became corrupt, a situation inflamed by the discovery of oil in West Africa.
Although Mali is often depicted as one of the poorest countries in the world, Mali is the 3rd gold producer in the world, and its resources are enormous.
American energy companies first found oil in the Gulf of Guinea in the late 1960s. Seeking to capitalize on this discovery, they established refineries and drilling rigs across the region. These installations called for American protection as the Cold War intensified. US Special Forces started operating in Mali for the first time.
It's important to understand the shift that we've seen in Western intervention. You certainly see less Western forces on the front line of fighting, and the ones that are there tend to undertake limited training or counter-terrorism operations.
The US funded countless aid programs in West Africa to increase their influence in the region. As more secretive special forces arrived in Mali, they started to hear rumors that a much greater wealth lay hidden in the Sahel. Their discoveries would drag foreign forces into a secret war for decades to come.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
As the Cold War drew to a close, Western democracies started to see new threats to their security. With worries of nuclear Armageddon receding, threats came from elsewhere. The new peril coming from lone actors carrying out terror attacks. America and Europe tried to buy their own security. By the early 90s, this influx of international aid to Mali started to fuel the fire of democracy. In 1991, a popular revolution overthrew Traoré's regime. The colonel of his personal guard, Amadou Toumani Touré, known as ATT, arrested him.
He was a charismatic and admired individual who had led the parachute intervention that had overthrown the dictatorship and supported the people power protests that established Malian democracy at the beginning of the 1990s.
10 years later, he would stand for election himself, going on to lead his country for almost 2 decades.
There was a lot of corruption because of the influence of money from drug smuggling across the Sahara, and there'd also been a problem because jihadist militants who had moved south from Algeria after the end of the internal conflict there had been engaging in hostage-taking and other destabilizing activities, again in the north. So the northern situation was very fragile.
Mali's slow transition to democracy opened up new opportunities for international foreign aid. In 2002, France announced that it was cancelling 40% of the debts owed to it by Mali. This amounted to more than $79 million.
Whatever happens in the West African CFA economy is something that France is a big stake in. Foreign donors give money out, humanitarian aid out, to sort of secure their presence and their economic interests in the country.
America also stepped up its foreign aid spending and sought to officially deploy troops in Mali for the first time. Secretly, both Europe and the US felt that if Mali was allowed to fail as a democracy, it would become a serious security risk.
It's worth remembering that in terms of frontier controls, there is only one country between Mali and Europe. There's Algeria or Tunisia or Libya. It's really quite close.
2004 was the year when the US started the program called the Pan-Sahel Initiative under the aegis of AFRICOM. What you have is the beginning of, sending in boots on the ground to, have more of a physical presence in the Sahara Desert.
America also expanded its secretive spying operations in Mali. The CIA attempted to establish a headquarters for this new spy network in Mali. Fearful of their expanding influence, President Touré put a stop to their plans. ATT had good reason to be reticent to America's offers of help. Prospectors sent by Western companies into the Sahel had uncovered vast oil, natural gas, and uranium deposits. Following the oil crisis in the late 1970s, France decided its energy future lay in nuclear power. French companies were established in West Africa to secure a uranium supply for their new industry. Major US energy companies also increased their investments in the region. Since 1992, it's estimated that these companies have spent nearly $2 trillion investing in African oil and gas.
Mali is a very rich country. It's just, managed and administered in such a corrupted way that the wealth is not redistributed equally to its people.
ATT wanted to ensure his share of this new wealth. With his government embroiled in rampant corruption, it was up to others to lead the resistance to the encroaching Western intervention in Mali. The Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi, expelled US and British military bases from his country when he took power in 1969. Gaddafi believed that Africa should be allowed to develop without Western foreign aid. He too had been investing in Mali.
You have this special relationship between Atatürk and Gaddafi, who had invested heavily in the tourist industry of Mali and who had been given a large number of hectares, I think about 100,000 hectares.
Gaddafi's anti-Western sentiment, Islam, and command of vast petroleum reserves made him attractive to Tuareg fighters. But his popularity amongst his own people would soon wane, as he went from dynamic revolutionary to bloated dictator. In 2011, as the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East, the Libyan people rose up against Gaddafi. AFRICOM troops were deployed to support the anti-Gaddafi fighters. America's NATO allies, especially France, launched an air war in the skies over Libya to stop Gaddafi from bombing his own people. AFRICOM's first war was considered a great triumph by Washington. America had eliminated its only major opponent to the secretive operations run by officers in the AFRICOM project.
When Gaddafi was finally tumbled in 2011 and he was killed, and Libya fell into complete disarray, the area of the Sahel became very unstable. So a lot of Al-Qaeda-related groups, groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, began to establish themselves across the Sahel, but particularly around Mali. Quite important was the fact that in Libya, Colonel Gaddafi, during his time in power, had built up massive supplies of small arms that were in dumps all over the country. And a lot of those weapons found their way into the Sahel region. And that's made the instability much worse there.
Salafist terror networks first gained a foothold in Africa in the former French colony of Algeria. A bitter civil war pushed these groups into Mali.
So we see in many parts of the world, and Mali and the Sahel especially, that Western forces tend to engage through regional and local forces who might represent one geographic area or one ethnic group. That's despite the fact that the Malayan government and the Malian army are both accused of ethnic bias. Jihadist groups use it as use ethnic tension as a recruitment method.
Rebranding themselves Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the terror group hoped to replace Algeria and Mali governments with an Islamic state. While its leaders were Algerian, many Al-Qaeda fighters were Tuareg.
Most ordinary young people in the north of Mali joined Islamist groups not because they were politically convinced about the Islamic State project, but because it was their only way out of poverty and their only way to have enough means to buy food and medicines and help their families out.
In 2012, a Tuareg rebel group, the National Movement of the Liberation of Azawad, the MNLA, attacked Timbuktu and took over northern Mali.
You have a growing sense of support for the MNLA, the Tuareg separatist Azawad movement, driven partly by a justified feeling that the government down in Bamako, more than 1,000 kilometers away, often neglected the north.
President Touré's corrupt government struggled to respond to the crisis. Army units dispatched to fight the Tuareg soon discovered they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned.
Malian army was one of the weaker armies in West Africa. So as they came under attack from this new upsurge in violent activity and armed activity, in some cases, garrisons just crumbled. And the situation was made particularly bad after a massacre at Agul Haq, which is in the Malian Sahara, where a garrison were captured by the rebels and were all killed. They were killed in cold blood after they'd surrendered.
Faced with unfavorable odds, the army rebelled against President Touré, and in March 2012, he was deposed. But what proved popular in Bamako was not met with support globally. Within a week of the coup, the African Union, America, and Europe suspended aid to Mali.
If there's a crisis in West Africa, then there may be more migration pressure on Europe, but it's not just that. The French concluded that the jihadist takeover of northern Mali was a fundamental threat to the security, not just of French interests in the country. What really matters for France are two things: a concern about the long-term security threat to Europe if the Sahel falls under the control of jihadists.
For the West, within the global context of the war on terror, the declaration of an Islamic State in Mali was what they feared most. Despite extensive spy networks, Washington couldn't understand the key differences between Tuareg nationalists and Islamic State fundamentalists.
There are two different types of Tuareg. There are Tuaregs who joined the secular groups, the MNLA, the CMA, the coordination of the Azawad movements, for example, and many others. And there's also jihadist Tuareg. We know, for example, that one of the first jihadist groups called Ansar ad-Din was set up by a Tuareg from Kidal called Iyad Akali.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
Ansar Din, an Al-Qaeda offshoot, espoused a strict version of Islam. In a matter of weeks, they had swept aside the moderate Tuareg and imposed Sharia law on Timbuktu. The Islamists were well funded. By the end of 2010, it's estimated that Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb had more than 250 million euros in its war chest. The WikiLeaks publication of diplomatic cables a year later revealed that President Touré assisted Ansar Din in raising cash. The leader of the supposed pinnacle of African democracy secretly took bribes from those who would seek to destroy it. As Mali's government foundered, world leaders secretly started to make plans to stop terror groups from taking over Mali. In July, as the government in Bamako started to collapse, the militants destroyed Sufi tombs, which had existed since the 15th century. More than 300 would be razed to the ground. UNESCO warned that Timbuktu's unique culture and heritage was under threat.
After the jihadists had taken over the north, there was deep resentment and anger and a lot of worry. It's perceived as part of the national territory as something of quite strong cultural significance. And you've got really historic places that are fundamental to West African history, such as Timbuktu, with its libraries filled with medieval Islamic texts. Parts of the north are also quite important in terms of the Malian economy.
Amid the power vacuum left by President Touré's removal, world leaders felt they needed to take charge. In December 2012, the United Nations Security Council passed a unanimous resolution to deploy thousands of troops to northern Mali. Plans for an African-led military operation were soon beset by delays. As the weeks dragged by, it appeared the Islamists would take over the whole country.
They were in an alliance, and they suddenly decided to start pushing south. If you look on the map, Mali consists of two large lumps of territory, a northern lump and then a southern lump with a narrower waist in the middle, and that roughly was where the front line lay. The jihadists were trying to break through at Konna, which was the northernmost defense line of the Malian army.
France offers to take the lead in the fight to reclaim their former colony. They set out to solve Mali's problems through military muscle.
The problem with counter-terrorism policy as it's currently being undertaken is it's focused on enemy. The idea of militarily identifying and destroying an enemy. Mali is one of the poorest countries in the world, and people are queuing up to provide military support and military equipment. But things like security sector reform or food security are falling on deaf ears when it's clear that some of the key drivers of terrorist activity is unemployment and poverty.
In late December 2012, French fighter jets started striking Islamist positions across northern Mali.
French troops that were based in Burkina Faso, they sent combat helicopters quickly to try and help stabilize at Konna. And then, in the space of a very few days, the French sent thousands of troops to Mali.
Their mission was not without risks. French commandos landed in Bamako a few weeks later. These elite fighting men were the first wave of Operation Serval, named after the African wildcat. Much like their namesake, these secretive soldiers were experts at hunting down their prey in the difficult desert terrain. More than 3,000 French troops headed into the Sahel to battle Ansardine. Their mission? To liberate Mali from the Islamist threat.
France inevitably felt a certain sense of responsibility to try to stabilize Mali, and Britain didn't quite feel that same sense of responsibility to Mali, but did feel a sense of responsibility to its ally France. But Britain deployed some special forces, rumored to be only maybe 20 or so, along with some MI6 officers, because the job in Mali, the job that Britain could help with, was in trying to track down Al-Qaeda cells and Al-Qaeda leaders.
The Islamists had been in control for almost a year, but when faced with French special forces, they disappeared off into the desert. They left a parting gift. Before abandoning Timbuktu, 2 libraries containing thousands of manuscripts were burned to the ground. In a matter of weeks, northern Mali was back under French control.
In this crisis situation, the Malians felt that the French had come in and had rescued them. And there was a huge popular welcome for the initial French intervention.
3 weeks after launching Operation Serval, François Hollande was given a rapturous welcome when he visited the recaptured Timbuktu.
Merci beaucoup de nous avoir enlevés de ce pétrin avec ces gens-là.
Hollande promised that French troops would stay as long as needed, but secretly made plans to pull his commandos out. He'd been elected a year earlier, promising to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. An extended commitment to a desert war in a far-flung former colony would not prove popular with French voters.
Le retrait n'est pas négociable. Le retrait des forces combattantes est une décision de la France.
Making grand promises was easy. Securing democracy in Mali, much harder. In July 2013, the United Nations agreed to take over responsibility of securing the north of Mali. France started to withdraw some troops. More than 12,000 peacekeepers are deployed to Mali, with a mandate to ease the country's transition back to democracy.
By many metrics, the international engagement in Mali and the wider Sahel region cannot be defined as a success. We see that stability in the region has gone down and has spread to different parts of the country and different parts of the region, and terrorist groups have increased the number of attacks rather than decreasing.
Al-Qaeda and Ansar Dine changed their tactics. They focused on capturing potentially lucrative hostages, such as aid workers, or carried out attacks before fleeing into the dunes.
The idea that counter-terrorism operations can do nothing is seen in the fact that we have invested billions of pounds over years, and rather than addressing the threat, it seems like the terrorist groups that we targeted in 2012 have dispersed and spread and become more violent. So we see that they've moved from the north of the country, and there's now increasing violence in central Mali and southwestern Mali.
Amid this chaotic backdrop, Paris and Washington decided an election was required to start Mali's journey back to democracy. They made an election the condition of releasing nearly $4 billion worth of aid. In August 2013, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, a former Prime Minister of Mali and member of the Bambara tribe, was duly elected. Like 18 previous presidents, Keïta launched an anti-corruption drive.
The levels of corruption are still very high. There is no control, at least financial control, over large sums of money that are floating internationally for all sorts of different reasons.
In 2013, the Tuareg were persuaded to reach a tentative peace deal with the government. It appeared that peace and stability were returning to the Sahel. Ambassadors at the UN headquarters in New York started to focus their attention on burgeoning humanitarian disasters in the Sudan. François Hollande became the most unpopular president in French history. The international news media left Mali. But far from the front covers, UN troops were dying in the desert. A fight that would fester away from the world's scrutiny. A year after Operation Serval launched, 60% of the French troops deployed in Mali had returned home. To international observers, it appeared the French-led intervention was a great success. Mali had not fallen to Islamic militants. The jihadists may have lost territory, but they hadn't given up the fight. By 2015, more than 50 peacekeepers were dead and hundreds injured, following daily battles in the Sahel sand dunes. The UN's mission in Mali, called MINUSMA, was to be the deadliest in its history. Chronically underfunded, world leaders were slow to deliver on their promise of support for troops on the ground.
Les attaques contre les casques bleus des Nations Unies constituent un crime de guerre conformément au droit international.
UN peacekeepers were given an impossible mission. On the one hand, they needed to foster dialogue between Mali's different tribes. On the other, troops found they couldn't be witnesses to ethnic cleansing.
A large number of atrocities that really have been committed by the Malian army has never been really disclosed.
A tentative peace deal with the Tuareg separatists broke down. The UN found itself on a battlefield, fighting seasoned desert militants who had nothing to lose.
The fact that international forces, despite years of investment, still aren't able to secure large parts of the country means that they often struggle to undertake the mandate they were sent to achieve. So the UN mission in Mali expends 80% of its own logistics on protecting its own infrastructure.
This balancing act was made all the more precarious by the extensive involvement of French commandos and the elusiveness of a nimble, resourceful enemy.
They couldn't foresee that, Islamic fighters would move all the way from Syria and Somalia all the way to Mali. The Sahara can be seen as a sea, and oases as islands, and it's impossible to control.
In the summer of 2014, with the UN and French troops increasingly coming under attack, Paris took the decision to deploy more special forces across the Sahel.
Secretive units of Western forces, they don't require the same level of parliamentary and public debate as conventional deployments.
Operation Barkhane, named after a crescent-shaped sand dune, saw French legionnaires secretly train local forces and conduct operations in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Chad. Backed by intelligence officers from the US and Britain, the French legionnaires sought to confine the jihadist groups to northern Mali.
It's a typical special forces response. Is not to get involved in deep operations that go on forever. Just to move in, do the job, get out, and remember, we can come back. Special forces will never win a war for you, but you need special forces to identify who you're after.
Despite killing some key Islamist leaders, by 2015, France appeared to be locked into a never-ending war in the desert. With secret operations and terror attacks a daily occurrence. For the people of Mali, the Radisson Blu attack on the 20th of November 2015 was shocking because its victims were foreign nationals, as opposed to Malians. It forced the world to recognize the limitations of foreign intervention.
Nulle part dans le monde aujourd'hui, nos valeurs ne sont pas les leurs. J'ai dit que la valeur vie leur est inconnue.
Despite a peace agreement in 2015, the situation in the north is still not stabilized. There have been continuing terrorist attacks, and feelings have become much more complicated. And there's a perception that the French, with their high-tech military resources, should be able to just take on those elements of the Northern Rebellion who are mostly jihadists and just squash them. In reality, of course, in the vastness of the Sahara, this is not feasible.
In Mali's capital, Bamako, President Keita continues to ignore the lawlessness slowly engulfing his country. Audits of government agencies found that Mali lost more than $150 billion due to fraud and bad management between 2013 and 2014.
And until corruption is cracked, impunity is cracked, Mali will never go back to be a state in its own right. It will always be a sort of, pawn of some other international power.
No longer satisfied with just holding territory in northern Mali, jihadist groups now hold global ambitions. Terror networks such as ISIL, chased out of Syria and Iraq, find a fertile recruiting ground in northern Mali.
In November 2019, 2 French helicopters collided while supporting a ground force pursuing Islamic groups in the border regions of Mali. This is the largest number of French soldiers killed on a single day since 58 soldiers were killed in Beirut 38 years ago. And so it's unsurprising that following the incident, there's been increasing challenge aimed at the French government as to why France is in Mali and what it's trying to achieve and what these soldiers died for.
In 2019, the UN envoy to Mali warned that there were more than 60 million weapons circulating in the Sahel. Nearly 200 peacekeepers have died. France is committed to an extended campaign, but it's unclear how many other nations are willing to continue their support of this secretive operation, waging war in the desert.
What is happening, I think, in the bigger picture is that we are conflating a governance problem, a political problem, with a military problem. The program to counter terrorism has had the opposite effect of, creating an escalation of armed terrorist groups. And unfortunately, I do not think that military force or the UN peacekeeping mission is strong enough to replace the government of Mali. I think there is a lot of information that we're not given and a lot of intelligence that isn't being disclosed.
Hope of a short-term solution to this secret war has long since faded, expired in the heat of the Saharan sun.